Okay, well, thanks for coming, everyone. Yeah, I have a handful of questions here, and depending on the amount of time we have, I think some people in the audience would likely have some questions too. But in going through all of this stuff for the exhibit, I kept a couple things on a list, knowing that you may be coming at some point. So I'm really excited to ask you about a couple of these things. But so the first thing I wanted to ask is Brian Murray, who of course you replaced as head coach, said, if you're in the business of coaching, Scotty Bowman is who you compare yourself to and copy. So since you obviously couldn't compare yourself to yourself and copy yourself, I wanted to ask, who you kind of look to compare yourself to and who to copy.
Well, I started a long time ago. I was injured, and I was disappointed. Trying to be a hockey player, but there was only 6 teams in the league, and I got started very young. I think I was 19 when I started coaching junior. I had some players that were 20, so I ended up. And I always tell people I ended up coaching when I was 69, and I had players that were a lot younger. Our family was a lot younger than the players I had. So the opposite. But no, I grew up in Montreal, and I was a teenager. I was big in the 1950s, and a little bit of history. The Red Wings finished first place in the NHL with 6 teams, 6 times in a row, from 1948 to 1955, and they won 4 cups. And when you win first place, you don't always win the cup. But they won the cup in 1950, they won the cup in 1952, and in 1954, 1955. And actually, the 1952 team still has something that'll never be. Well, first of all, there's more than 2 series, but they won both series 4 straight, 4-0, and the other team played 4 games, 2 in each series in Detroit, and never scored a goal. So the goalie, Terry Sawchuk, was the goalie. And in 1955, I had moved up, and I started coaching in about 1951. 1955, I had another junior team, and oddly enough, I had one really good player, and he wanted to go to college, university, and our coach was good friends with a Detroit scout at the time, and the team was sponsored by Montreal. And they were the 2 rivals in that whole decade. So, anyways, he was trying to get me to release the player to go and play junior with one of the Detroit teams, and I did get to the 7th game in 1955, and that was the last Stanley Cup win for Detroit till 1997, and it was a 7-game series. I think it was in overtime. I'm not sure, but they won the cup, and history says, and I've read a lot about Ted Lindsay because I was only a teenager, but he said that they could have won more cups, but they broke up the team, and they started trading players away, and then Montreal won 5 straight from 1956 right through to 1960. So if you think about a decade of 10 years, the only team that went in between Detroit and Montreal was Toronto. They won in 1951, but it was quite a decade. And I got to see, I was coaching, and for coaching one of their teams, I didn't get much compensation, but I got a forum pass, and I could go to all the NHL games. So oddly enough, I was a Montreal farm player, and when I got injured, and I was all for Montreal, but I never missed a Detroit game. I remember those players would come in all dressed up. I'd try to get to the rink real early at the Forum, and they didn't have the luxury of these guys. They took taxis, usually line by line. I remember Gordie Howe and Ted Lindsay, and first it was Sid Abel, then it was Alex Delvecchio, Dutch rival, and they would come by line out of the taxis, and I would go up with a lot of fans and look at these guys. And then, of course, later on, to jump way ahead, when I came to Detroit, I got to know Ted very well because Ted was in our dressing room, even the late stages of his life. And Gordie was in a lot too because Mark, his son, was playing for us early in the 90s. So it's just an amazing ending. Like, you know, I came to Detroit in 1993. We had 3 tough years. We were close, but you know, it doesn't help you in hockey. And we didn't win, but you know, it took 3 losses, a lot of adversity, and then all of a sudden it clicked. And then, of course, we won the first 2 in 97 and 98, and we had those Hall of Fame players. And, you know, it was a dream for me because it was the last stop along the way. I'd coached, I got my first opportunity in St. Louis when the team expanded from 6, the league expanded from 6 to 12. I started in St. Louis, and I went back to my hometown in Montreal. And then I went, after that, I left and went to Buffalo. I got the manager-coach job, which was pretty tough doing 2 jobs. I know you couldn't hardly do one now, but they have all kinds of assistants and everything. But I left Buffalo, and I went into television for about 3 years, and then I got an opportunity to go to Pittsburgh, and that was my last stop before I came to Detroit with the opportunity to maybe coach 2 years. And I wasn't planning on coaching a lot longer, and neither were the ownership. And all of a sudden, I stayed 9. That was the best thing I ever could do. And then I stayed another from 2002 to 2008. I stayed with the Red Wings. They won another cup under Mike Babcock, 2008. And then I had a lifetime job with the Red Wings. I could have stayed on, but my son Stanley was working as an assistant with Chicago, and then they gave him the manager's job. And unfortunately, he was very young. He was 34, and he got Hodgkin's cancer. And I tried. They offered me a chance to go and be a senior advisor. I didn't really want to leave Detroit, but just to tell you what kind of a man Mike Ilitch was, I called him up and I said, I told him the story. I had mixed feelings about even going there. My family felt I should go, and he said to me that family comes first. It's a no-brainer. You should go. So that made me feel pretty good. And fortunately, Stanley, and unfortunately, he got a relapse after 6 months, and it came back. But he beat it, and he was here last night. And he's not with Chicago anymore, but he grew up, and he was, you know, now he's 49, and he's lived a good life. So, but anyways, that was my story about coaching in Detroit, and it was a great last stop.
Yeah, I'll say. I wanted to ask too. You briefly mentioned that Stanley Cup series against New Jersey, and I wonder, the Red Wings were so heavily favored going into that. I wonder if you play that series 10 times, do you think how many would you guys have won? How many would New Jersey have won? You think?
They were a very strong defensive team, and actually, Detroit was on the upswing when I got here. They could score a lot of goals, but unfortunately, in the playoffs, goal scoring becomes kind of hard to do. The defensive teams, the ones that can play good defense, and they had a wonderful defensive team, and it was a big disappointment because we were the favorites. The games were close, but they could defend, and I think it taught our team a lot because even the next year, we had a wonderful regular season, 95-96, and I even mentioned it last night. We made a terrible mistake one night in December of 95. We went into Montreal, and we beat them 11-2, and we forced their goaltender to get upset. They left him in, Patrick Roy, and then they ended up making a bad trade. They traded him to our best rival, our arch rival, who needed a goalie, otherwise they wouldn't have won, and he went to Colorado. So we kind of cost ourselves that cup. But I can laugh about it now. But then we went on the next year, and oddly enough, in the cups I was here, and Mike Vernon was the goalie in the first 96 team, or 97, Chris Osgood in 98, and then later on, of course, I'm getting ahead of my game, Dominic Hasek came for a couple of years. So it's oddly enough that a team would win 3 cups in 6 years and 3 different goalies. So it's an oddity.
Yeah, you mentioned the two goalies too, particularly in 96, 97. I wanted to ask too, what kind of tipped you off that Vernon was the guy going into the playoffs?
Well, he had played for Calgary, and they won the Cup in '96 against. Montreal beat them. Patrick Roy beat Mike Vernon in '96, and then in 86, and then in 1989 they reversed it, and Mike Vernon was with Calgary, and they beat Colorado, and it was a tough decision because they both played during the season. But you want experience in the playoffs. And I said it even again, Mike Vernon was a good influence on a young goalie. Chris was only 21. It's not easy for goalies at 21 to try to play against Hall of Fame goalies like Patrick Roy, but they worked very close together. And Chris ended up winning the Cup in '98 and also again in 2008. So, and they're both goalies are very. If you look at the wins totals and Stanley Cups, they're really close to getting in the Hockey Hall of Fame, which is not easy, especially for a goalie. But we were able to build the team. Anytime we needed a player, didn't matter who it was, we were able to go out and get them. We had the backing of the ownership. Mike Ilitch had owned the team from 1982, 15 years before they could win that cup, and he really wanted. He was so anxious to get his name on a Stanley Cup, and he persevered with a slow start in the '80s. And the thing was, every time we wanted to get a player, if we called him up, I remember one year I was doing the trades, and we were looking for a defenseman that was going to be, not one of our top guys, but a pretty aggressive defenseman. He was on the market, Bob Rouse, and I called up Mike to tell him that, this player's on the market, free agent, and always the same question: can he help us win? And I said, I believe he can. He said, well, go for it. He never ever turned us down. And when you're in a situation where finances are big, he was a great supporter of trying to win that cup.
Boy, that's great. That kind of backing, instead of how much is he going to cost or something like that is always nice. Well, it brings up another question, too, about Brendan Shanahan. Looking back at this season, that trade at the beginning of the year seems like, it's easy as a historian to look back and go like, oh, yeah, that was it. That kind of galvanized the team and moved it forward. But I wonder, was there any trepidation, giving up what you gave up for Shanahan? Or was it kind of a slam dunk from the word go?
No, it was a difficult trade to do, but Keith Primo was heir apparent to being our number one center eventually, and he was a holdout, and I wasn't doing contracts, but the differences were huge, and it looked for a while that he's just not going to sign with us again unless he gets his way, and Mike Ilitch really favored him as a future, a star. And some other players came on the market, but, every time I would call him, he'd say, no, he can sit out all year, but I'm not trading him. He said, we need him to be a Red Wing. So then all of a sudden, Brendan Shanahan had played in Hartford. The team moved to Carolina, to Raleigh, North Carolina. He was not happy with that, and somehow it got out in the media that Brendan Shanahan, I think he was the captain of the team, and he requested a trade, and it wasn't an easy trade, but we had to trade value, and we needed that other piece of the puzzle. We were close, as everyone knows, and I think it was a couple of days before the opening game, and we ended up trading Keith Primo, and we had Paul Coffey on a long contract. We had replacements, and so we decided we'll go for it. We'll certainly, Paul was a good defenseman, but his contract had a lot of longevity to it. So we said that this player can come in and play. And I always realized what he did for us, but I saw your notes about him, and he came in and I remember he just came in the morning of the opening game, and he scored 45 goals, and I think he had 87 points. He scored 9 goals in the playoffs. And he added dimension to our team because we were not easy to play against. We had fellas like McCarty and Joe Koser and guys like that. And Brendan was a really physical player, and he was a skilled player. He could score goals like the best of them. And he was the player that we really needed to put us over the top. And when you can trade for a player and he ends up in the Hall of Fame, then you're very fortunate, because he was a number 2 pick in the 1989 draft. And he had a real good career till 1997, 96, 97. So that was one of the crowning touches to get to building up a team, because we picked up a lot of players along the way. We picked up, we picked up Igor Larionov. We had to trade a good scorer. Before that, we got Mike Vernon, because we felt we needed an experienced goaltender, and we had to trade a good defenseman, Steve Chason, the late Steve Chason. He was a very adequate defenseman, but goalies are more important. And then we ended up making a real good deal. We got Mike Vernon, and then Larry Murphy was not doing well in Toronto, and they just traded him to us, so we took over his contract. It was only going to be for the rest of the year, and he ended up playing about 5 years. And we got lucky in a lot of the moves, because you have to be fortunate. We got Kirk Malpe from Edmonton for a minor league player, and he developed into an NHL player. Prior to me, the Red Wings picked up Chris Draper in a deal with Winnipeg, the previous regime, for $1. And when you have a team like we had, and there's 7 on that last team in Hall of Fame, and you have Hall of Fame defensemen like we had, like Nick Lidstrom and certainly Larry Murphy, and then later Chris Chelios. It's not going to work unless you have those workers. And the Draper, the 4 of them, I always kid them. I said, no wonder you were good. There was 4 of you on the same line. But they set the table in a lot of games, because they were strong. They were strong checkers. They accepted their role as they didn't get 20 minutes like some of the big guys got, but you were assured that every night they went on the ice, they would outwork the other team, and that's what you need. So they were an integral part of us winning the Stanley Cup, and I give them a lot of credit.
There's, maybe you just answered this question, but you always hear coaches say, boy, if I had a team full of this guy, it'd make my job really easy. I wanted to ask who that guy or guys were when your time.
Well, we had, when I came here, Vladimir Konstantinov and Sergei Fedorov were on the Red Wings. Slava Kozlov had just played in the minors, but he was just drafted by Detroit, and we ended up bringing him up, and we had the 3 of them. And then one year, we just before we played that Devils in March or April, the thing on Fetisov said April, but it was at the trade deadline. We picked up a trade. He was sitting in the stands in New Jersey, like a 7th or 8th defenseman. He was 37, and we were looking for depth on our defense corps in case of injury, getting ready for the playoffs. And we had to trade a late round or mid-round pick, which to me wasn't. It's hard to pick players after the 1st or 2nd round. So we traded the pick to New Jersey. Fortunately, the manager in New Jersey is a pretty tough cookie, Lou Lamoriello. He's still a manager. He's 80 years old, and he built a lot of good teams. And he was fond of Slava Fetisov as a person, and he really wanted to, they weren't going to use him. So we made that trade, and we did lose that year to New Jersey, of course. He was running the team. And then most of the summer, you keep in touch with some of the players. And Slava, about the middle of July one year, said, Larionov, and Igor was with San Jose when we got beat in '94. He said he wants to come to Detroit. And I said, well, they're not going to trade him. I'd like to have him. And then he said, well, I don't know. He really wants to come. So we made the trade. We traded a real good goal scorer, Ray Shepard. He had 30-something goals. And then Igor was the final piece of that 5-man puzzle with the Russians. And that would give us another dimension. The other teams had a hard time defending against them because we never saw that kind of hockey in the NHL. Puck possession, moving around. I had nothing to do with it. I mean, I had a good relationship. A couple of times I said to Slava he was a very inquisitive guy, and he'd say, if there's anything you see, Coach, that you want to change, let me know, And I said, Slava, I don't know what you're doing, but whatever you're doing, keep doing it. So I can't take any credit for the Russian 5, But I was careful. I didn't want the other team to know what they were doing, and I used them. I tried to use them, at the right occasion. But looking at tapes of what they did in certain games, it was just amazing.
Yeah, and really they get a lot of credit too for like kind of changing the way hockey's taught. At least I've read. Up till then it was a lot of dump and chase, and now it's more puck possession and that. But I wonder what, and I'm sure you've been asked this in the last couple of days, but how you compare those eras, 97, 98 till today. Is that one of the things that's changed, kind of that more European style of play, or not so much?
The game has changed with taking out the center line. It's a different game completely. The puck is not brought up with a group of players. You can pass the puck from your own blue line up to the far blue line. It's a fast game. In fact, they've changed everything around. The game is so fast, and they made the end zones a little bit bigger, so that they don't cover the defensemen like they did in my day. They all go down and they play in an area right in front of the net. And the players today, I don't think a player back in when I started, and even at the end, if you could get by, if you weren't the fastest player on the team, but you were just adequate, but you had a very high IQ, which means you knew where players were. I don't know if you could play like that today, because every team, if you watch most of the players on every team, it's hard to pick out a poor skater. I shouldn't say the word poor, a slow skater. Every player is different, but that's the big change in the game, is that they took a lot of the hooking, holding, interference. They took all that out of the game, but still, it's not the players now, especially the forwards. They don't have any time and space to make plays. Some nights you get to the games, there's not a lot of scoring chances until there's a power play, because the players are so fast, they can get back quick. It's hard to get outnumbered chances unless they're making mistakes. It's still a room for a great individual player, but you got to be more team oriented. It's tough on individuals to try to do it themselves, because the other team, they play a defensive style.
And the last one I have for you, and then of course if we still have time and people in the audience might have some questions, I wanted to ask too about the success the Red Wings had with European players. And if kind of that shift to more European players in the NHL was just inevitable, or if people were copying your success, basically with the European players.
No, Detroit, what happened before I even got here, they had a tough time in the 80s. The team was not strong, and I think the main thrust was Jim DeVillano. He wanted to gamble. He said, we're not going to be able to build our team. So in one draft, he took 2 Russians. I think he took Sergei Fedorov, and he took Vladimir Konstantinov. Not on early picks, not on picks that were the first or second round. I don't know what rounds they were. And also Slava Kozlov. And he took a gamble, because in those years, players from the Iron Curtain could not leave. They could only leave when they're in their late 30s. Slava Fetisov and Igor Larionov are the best example. They were playing on the Red Army team till they were about 31, 32. And they were so upset the way the team was being run, they let those players out, but they were in their 30s. So they didn't want to lose any young players. And the Red Wings drafted those players, and how they were able to get them to leave Russia. I mean, there's a lot of stories. I don't know them all. I wasn't here. It was in 1989 or 1990. But when you think getting players like that was just, I wouldn't say a stroke of luck as much as it was taking an opportunity. We're not going to get a good player at that point from North America if they ever get out, and they worked hard on it. I'm not sure how all the mechanics of it, but there was one fellow with the Red Wings at the time. He's still in the league, and he's his son-in-law, Mike, the Illich family, Jimmy Lights. He was the president, and he was instrumental, along with other people in the organization. There's a lot of cloak and dagger stuff to get them out, but they came. And also they drafted Nick Lidstrom from Sweden. Other teams had passed on him. Hard to believe, but the Swedish players could leave, but the Soviet and Czech players couldn't leave.
The real last thing I'll ask you. It always strikes me that the sideline reporters interviewing the coaches on the way into the intermission break, that always seems like the coaches are a little bit annoyed with those interviews. That seems like a very annoying thing. Like you want to go in there and make adjustments and talk to your team, and here you have to give this quick interview for TV. Is that annoying, I guess?
Well, it just started near the end of my career, and it was kind of like a trade-off because the coaches at that time didn't have much of an association. We tried hard. We wanted some benefits that we thought should have been ours, and so it's like a trade-off. They started to give them some benefits. One of the criterion was the coaches had to do interviews, especially with I think they originally did some in my day when the play was on. Now they wait for a stoppage, and then they get it. They do the interview, and then they tape it, and then they play it back. But first couple of national games that I wasn't all for it, so I used to take my left hand and turn off the mic. And then all of a sudden, the producer would be upset, and I said, "Oh, what's wrong with the mic?" But that didn't last very long, and it was interesting to think about it. And I used to try to say, "Well, why don't you interview one of the other coaches?" Because when you're the head coach, you got all the players to put on the ice. You got 12 forwards. The defense coach has probably 6. And I said, interview Dave Lewis or Barry Smith, and that was another thing that was very unusual. That when I came to Detroit, Dave Smith was already in place as an assistant coach, and they asked would I be. I didn't know much about Dave, and they said, would you mind keeping him on staff, and you can bring somebody along. So I brought Barry Smith. He was with me in Pittsburgh, and oddly enough, one of the secrets that I think worked is we had the same 3 coaches for 9 years. We all stayed. None of them, I'm sure they had opportunities to leave and go to other teams, but Dave Lewis was a wonderful coach for our defense. Barry Smith was strong on specialty teams. So, that was a big part of the game. But the interviews they're not as much distracting now because they're used to it, and they do it when there's a stoppage.
Great. Well, yeah, I'm not sure if we're okay. Sounds like we have 5 minutes, so maybe a couple audience questions if there's any out there. Yes, sir. Right over here.
Coach Bowman, you've worked with so many amazing people over the years. What would you say, from a leadership characteristic perspective, is what you admire most in some of those people?
Well, especially in Detroit, because we were able to get players that were high-profile players on other teams, and I give a lot of thought and credit to Steve Yzerman. He was a captain for 10 years. A lot of tough times in the playoffs. When you're a captain of a team for 10 years, you start at a young age. I think he was around 20 or 22 when he started, and desperately, it's on your resume that you don't win a Stanley Cup. And then we started to bring in these high-profile players from other teams. Some of them were veterans, but it was a quick, easy transition. As a coach, you don't spend much time in the dressing room, but I think what happened when all these good players came in, they respected the fact that they weren't in competition with Steve, and he wasn't a guy that continually was meeting with them. He was a quiet leader. He's a man that keeps things to himself a lot, but he's very thoughtful, and the thing most about Steve that I admired, what a competitor. When that game started at 7:30 or 7:40, he was in his zone for doing nothing. There's nothing else that he was like. Some nights he'd be so upset at the official. Like, I mean, he was such a competitor. Like, things weren't going against or with us. And some of the players had to say, Steve, lay off. But he's an ultra competitor. I mean, besides, he doesn't show it like some people do. But I was fortunate. I went to I went to Sarasota after I retired. And I've been there since 2005. And he went to the Lightning. And he was there for, I think, 10 years. And the team that won the 2 cups, he left the year before to come back to Detroit. It was a tough transition for him. He lived in Detroit. His family was going to high school and university. And he did a great job in Tampa, building up that team, hiring coaches, hiring scouts. And that team that won the 2 cups, his fingerprints are all over it. They got players in the draft that were late bloomers, like some were free agents. He's starting to do it with Detroit now. He's got a defenseman that won the Rookie of the Year. He single-handedly scouted that player, Moritz Seider, from Europe. And he's just young, 20, won the Rookie of the Year. And, he was rated in the draft about number 15. And Detroit had the 6th pick. And he said he didn't care about numbers. He's we're taking him. And now he's like, if you put all that draft back in, those 15 players, he's probably number 1. And same as he did with the young kid Raymond. He's born in 2002. I mean, he's only 20 years old. And they got a couple of other. It's a long process. You have to get good draft picks first. Then you have to surround them with your. That's what happened with the Red Wings in the 90s. We had a pretty good nucleus. Then we started adding these other pieces that were important. And they've got a very good young defenseman. He's only, I think, 19. He could probably play a little bit now. His name is Simon Edvinson. And unless something goes really off the rails, he's going to probably be here within a year or 2. And I would think having he and Seider for a decade, like your defensemen are hard. They're awful hard to find exceptional defensemen, that can play a long time. And they have a good pipeline in Sweden. They have a scout in Sweden. He's here now. They brought him over to watch some tournaments and that, but he's here. His name is Håkan Andersson. He's been with the Red Wings for about 30 years. All those players like, Zetterberg that was here, Datsuk, they weren't high draft picks. Like most people can pick a player in the 1st or 2nd round, but it's a special trait to get one in the 5th or 6th or something, because there's 32 teams, and you get a player number 1 pick, you got to wait till 33 to get the next one. So that's what it's going to take a bit of time, but I think he's on his way because they've got some players at least in the pipeline that are maybe a couple of years away.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Coach. I think, unfortunately, that's all we have time for, but I think we're going to go out and cut the ribbon on the exhibit here.